Welcome to the Ephesiology Podcast, a podcast dedicated to the study of the early Christian movement and its implications for the church today. My name is Andrew Johnson. I am an associate pastor at Neartown Church. Today we have Michael, our resident ephesiologist, and we are blessed to be joined by Craig Whitney, the Vice President of Church Planting Strategies at Stadia. Now, Craig, in our little intro that we did before we got on the mics, you told us that the title is a little bit longer than that. So Craig, what is your actual full title there at Stadia?
Well, it is Vice President of Church Multiplication Strategy, and that transition from planting to multiplication is significant strategically for the kingdom, for churches, for leaders, and significantly right now for Stadia.
This is fun. Okay, so I can already tell you're excited about talking about this. I know Michael and I are excited, so we're going to call time out because I want our listeners to get to know you a little bit. If somebody were to want to get to know you in a better way, what are just a handful of like the most important things about Craig?
Sure. I am a native Northern Californian, and just by the fact that I said Northern, you know that that's significant. And
yeah, that's NorCal.
You have to live here.
Does that mean you don't want to associate with the southern part of California?
I am not from LA. I might be okay with San Diego, but I am not from LA. I have been married for 37 years. I have two adult children. One lives in the area and one lives right now in Bosnia. And so internationally, started a church. I told you I have adult kids. So, 30 years ago when they were little, in a small community called Windsor here in Northern California, have been helping others start churches for about 15 years, the last 7 with Stadia. If you wanted to know some personal things about me, I roast my own coffee. If you want to get together, do not invite me to a coffee shop that has a green logo and a mermaid. I do not drink their coffee. I cycle for exercise and have living here, beautiful foothills and places to cycle. And I am a Formula One fan, huge auto racing fan, but Formula One is not known to most Americans. So not many people to talk to about that.
Yeah. So you were excited about Monte Carlo the other day.
Yes. Actually, so this is the challenge of being a Formula One fan. I actually planned a trip to Florida so that I could go to the Miami Grand Prix, which is the first time they held a Formula One race in Miami. Then the tickets came out for sale and started at over $2,000.
So that was a dream that was immediately dashed.
So that dream ended and I watched the race on television like I always do.
Okay. So first of all, you had me at coffee. You had Michael at cycling. And if Matt would have been able to join us today, maybe he would have filled those F1 shoes and you just would have, hit the trifecta.
There you go.
Hilariously. So home for me is Indianapolis. That's where I'm from. And right after we got married, I worked at a restaurant, and when the Indy 500 is in town, I mean, literally our city swells with people and they take over. Well, while we were there, because it's a race town, while we were there, they had the F1 races.
Oh, okay. They're in that era. Yeah.
So that's when we were there. And we had a whole bunch of international, wonderful people come to our restaurant for the F1 races. And they'd get talking to me like, because I lived in Indianapolis, I automatically was a race fan. And I had to let them know I grew up here. I'm near enough to the speedway that I know when the races are happening because we can hear it. It's just so loud. And then to let them know, I don't like racing at all. And they were flummoxed. And I was serving people who were on pit crews with the F1 teams. And I was letting them know this. And they were so ashamed for me that they actually gave me tickets to go. And I knew immediately upon receiving them, they would be wasted. And so I gave them to two friends who would really enjoy it, and they had the time of their lives. So there is my F1 confession.
There you go. There you go. I'm trying to think of the appropriate metaphor. That's something like saying I'm a follower of Jesus, but I really don't like praying, or something of that nature. I'm not quite sure, but
yeah. Well, and that's the thing. I was very clear. I don't like racing. And so for them, they were like, oh, we have this guy who just doesn't like it. It's just because he hasn't had the right type of race to watch. And I'm like, we'll just give him F1. And I was like, I think you're missing what I'm saying. I just don't enjoy it. And that's okay. That's okay. So, Craig, so you were just starting with great excitement and joy to talk about why you were thrilled that you had to order new business cards because your title changed to go from somebody who was over church planting to be over church multiplication. Why is that such a big deal for you?
Really, it's the need for new churches. And I know you guys have mentioned this probably, I've actually heard it a couple of times on the podcast. One of the challenges in the realm of even the US, we sometimes talk about global church planting numbers, and we hear these things and how do we verify those? Nobody can even verify the numbers in the US. So we typically hear there's 3,000 to 4,000 churches started every year in the US. No one can actually verify that. Like, okay, where's the list of those 3,000 churches? It doesn't exist. I would argue that number is probably inflated by 2 times of reality because many churches get double counted. Stadia as an organization helps someone start a church, and they're also affiliated with the AG or maybe the Evangelical Covenant Church, and it's just kind of all of these things. And so there's these multiple counts that happen. It's not intentional. Nobody's like trying to be deceptive. Right. It's just not really getting factored into sort of the data process about what's actually happening. And so there's a tremendous need. Churches are closing. We know that the rate of church closures is increasing rapidly, and I think going to accelerate. That's sort of a whole nother conversation. We really think about the age of most of the churches that are closing. Many of them were started post World War II. There's some, history around churches typically lasting, a lifetime, 70 years. So we shouldn't be that surprised. And I'm not always convinced that a church closing is a bad thing. It's kind of in the same way that, a person dying, followers of Jesus still die and go to heaven. And I think there's churches that sort of serve their purpose. They live out their mission in a season. What's not good is when churches are closing and new churches are not being started. And sort of, rather than being a generational transition, it's actually a death. It's a loss. Population is growing still. We know that. And there's all kinds of data about the rise of the nuns, particularly in the US context, Western context. So there's this tremendous need to start thousands of new churches every year, sort of just to keep up with what has been the ratio of churches to population. But that's not what's happening. And so how do we rapidly accelerate the number of new churches that are started? And that's really where multiplication comes in, is we really have to, particularly in the West, shift to and sort of understand the importance of multiplication, that the goal is not a church that grows. Growth is good. Multiplication is better. Churches that multiply over a lifetime, just imagine any local church that, helped start one new church a year for its lifetime. And think about what the impact of that is over the lifetime of that church versus if that church does not multiply. And so how are we helping to accomplish that? How are we resourcing churches to multiply? How are we helping them think differently about who the next new church leader is? There's a whole bunch of things that get wrapped up in sort of this idea of how do we really transition from church planting to church multiplication.
I love that idea. Craig, tell us a little bit about the kind of what you see as the recent trend in church planting. And here I'm trying to lead you to talk about how we've been focused really on church starting over the past couple of decades. Describe that. What's a characteristic or the difference
Sure.
between planting a church and starting a church?
I started a church 30 plus years ago. So have a long perspective. And I think in the era when I started a church, at least in my own awareness, there was kind of only one way that you did it. You found a place to meet and you started having a Sunday gathering where there was, and everybody advertised this, right? We had contemporary music, we had relevant preaching, we had great kids programs. I don't know if we ever put good coffee on our postcards, and we mailed out postcards to our community, and we invited people to come to church. And to be honest, we started a church that way. And the reality is I look back and I realize we led a lot of people to faith. There's people that I know today that came to faith in Jesus. I can remember baptizing them. Just those kinds of things that came out of that strategy. Maybe part of it's being a Californian. That is an almost pointless, completely futile activity in my context right now. Because if that's the strategy you use, the approach you use to start a church, you can almost guarantee that the only people who are going to show up are people who are already followers of Jesus.
And why is that? What's changed, do you think, in that 30-year period of time?
Well, again, at least in my own California context, I live in a secular context. Particularly people probably under the age of 50, maybe under 40, 60% of them are self-identify as atheist or agnostic. Only, maybe 3-4% are really, engaged evangelical Christians. There is a significant Catholic population here, largely because of the Latino immigration that has come here. And so there's a significant portion of that population that is engaged in the Catholic Church. But if I walk down the street and just start talking to people, I pretty much have to assume the people that I am talking to have no faith in any God. They are secular people. Now, how well they are informed sort of in their atheism or their agnosticism will really vary. You meet true atheists are kind of rare. Most people are kind of pragmatic atheists than really thought out atheists. But anyways, and so you have to start in a different place. Would you come to church with me? It's really actually what you were just saying about racing, right? Why would someone gave you race tickets and you didn't want to go, Andrew, because you don't like racing. So I invite somebody to come to church. Why should I think they're going to come with me? They don't believe in God. They don't like religious experiences. These things are all completely irrelevant to them. And so it's kind of, that's nice for you. Sometimes it's, you're one of those wackos. And that's the extent of it. So you've got to start in a very different place if you want to introduce people to Jesus.
Thank you very much for redeeming my opening analogy. I think
planned that.
It was amazing. Right? Over the internet, high five. I really think, I would, when I say lovingly push back, it's not to disagree with you on the actual major points. It's to disagree with you on the finer points. I don't think your observations are purely because you're a Californian. I am almost positive that your reflections right now are actually truer than most of America would like to admit are truer about what people around us are wanting and what they are expecting. And just their entire relationship to church, religion, Jesus, God, the whole lot of it. And as somebody who's now in Texas, the absolute shining star of the Bible Belt, right? Like for everybody who's going to say, if there's a place in America that's highly religious, it's got to be Texas. It's true where we are, right? It's true that more people, you cannot go to them and say, well, I'm going to fill in the blanks with what I know you already know. And I'm going to jump in further down the alphabet where I'm just going to go because you already know the ABCs of all this. Well, why would you assume that? Why would you assume that? And so for the discussion on giving somebody something of eternal, present and eternal value is not going to be all wrapped up in the, hey, do you want to come with me to church?
Right. Yep. Yeah. And it's interesting too, because I think the other thing I would say that's probably shifted that I have more awareness of in my own lifetime is sort of the questions of truth. So I grew up on, like Josh McDowell and, evidence that demands a verdict. I have the sense that there's a significant part of the population around me that even if I could somehow provide them with this historical proof that Jesus died and was buried and rose again, they would look at me and simply say, so what? It's not even that they would, kind of deny, oh, that didn't really happen. It's that even the historical truth of it doesn't mean anything. And so I think I express this to people who are planting churches in some of our training. I think the questions you have to realize that people are asking, the first question people are going to ask is, do you like me? They want to know if they're going to be accepted by you. I think a lot of times if they've had experiences with Christians, they assume they're not going to be accepted. Mm-hmm. And then they want to kind of ask this question of, are you like me? Like do we have anything in common? Or are you somehow so different from me that, we're just never going to connect in any kind of way? And if you can answer those questions positive, then you kind of enter into a relationship with someone. You build a friendship on those kind of factors. But then I think the real question that most people are asking is your life better than mine?
Wow, that's something to think about.
And that's an entirely different evidence that demands a verdict.
Exactly.
Right? You know what I mean?
Right. Because they're not looking like, I can't go get out the books and the proof, right? Because that's not what they're looking at. They're looking at me. And they're asking the question is your life better than mine? Are you less stressed than I am? Are you happier than I am? Is your marriage better than mine? Are you having an easier time with your kids than I am? Kind of larger things. Do you have some sense of purpose in your life that I don't have? Some sense of joy and satisfaction. That's going to vary from person to person. And I think oftentimes kind of that question sort of relates to what they sort of feel is most lacking in their own life.
Right.
Then they're looking for, well, do you have that in yours? So if my marriage is a mess, I'm really paying attention to your marriage, but maybe I've got a good marriage, but I don't have any sense of meaning in my life. So then I might pay more attention to that. So you got to get to know people and kind of know where their questions are. But yeah, the sort of postmodern American apologetic is your life.
Yeah. Yeah. You know what? That's at the same time encouraging and discouraging.
Yes.
Because we think about what we're observing, or at least what I've observed, and Craig, you might have seen this even more than me. I'm sure you have, is that our tendency to church plant today has not been that. I mean, that takes too long to develop relationships and get to know people. We want something now. We want to get that brick and mortar in place and have the trendy worship band and I won't go there, Andrew. I think you might know what I'm going to say, but but that's what we want. We want that now. We want whatever that is, we want it now. But what you're talking about, that takes time.
Well, and here's the other part, which makes it really, really difficult, Michael. So like, I understand, especially even the sauce or the sassiness, crankiness, maybe that comes with some of the things that we're talking about, because none of us want the long game. And we really do want those short results. It is very much that I want it now mentality, that consumer mentality that has dominated America. It has seeped into our faith. It becomes what we look through and expect. Faithfulness is really... It's a slow process. It's a day by day process. And at the same time, we still want to, I think at some level, we still feel like we want to be valuable or feel that our time is worthwhile. And so if I am living faithfully and I am loving others well, and yet I am not seeing a quote unquote end product like I want, then it makes me almost feel, well, I mean, Craig, to your point, maybe my life isn't as good as I wanted it. Maybe is this worth it? Is this actually having a result on the people around me? And so again, it's really easy to throw stones at some of the short-sightedness of it, but I think there's a lot of humility, at least I want us to approach with this, that sometimes there's very good motivations that lead to sadness in the long game.
Mm-hmm. I do think time's significant, though. And one of the things I've always found fascinating is the metaphors for the church in the New Testament, really with one exception that I'm aware of, are all organic. The exception is when Paul says that, you're stones, except even then, I kind of feel like the Holy Spirit sort of nudged him and he had to put the word living in front of stones, so that somehow that in itself would be organic and not struck. So if you think about church planting, right, Michael, you sort of, that distinction of church starting, church planting, if you plant something, how long does it take to grow and to bear fruit? I grew up in the Napa Valley, grapes, wine, don't know what people's opinions are about the consumption of that, but
we know Jesus' opinion.
Yes. You don't put a grape seed in the ground and make wine next year. It takes years to get from seed to grapes, and then even the process of wine is a whole nother lengthy, right? And so there's just this long process. And I think, yeah, you're right. And there's everything has to be sort of hurried up. And I feel like that's we've sort of taken, it's really more not even technology, it's really industrial ideas.
I was thinking the same thing.
Right. And applied them to the church. And we're going to build a factory and we're going to produce this product in the most efficient means possible. So raw material comes in one end and whatever it is, a washing machine, a car, whatever phone comes out the other end. That's just not, there's no way that you could sort of take that analogy and apply that to disciple making in the scripture. The two things just don't go together. And so I think we have to sort of rethink, or at least realize where we've kind of applied that and begin to think more like farmers, more organically, and recognize that, I guess, right actions, to your point, Aaron, right actions don't always produce immediate outcomes. And so there is a faithfulness required. I believe in fruitfulness. So I would tell you, I believe if you are faithful, you will be fruitful. But that's different than saying if you're faithful, you're going to see, new believers.
This exact fruit in this exact way.
Yes.
And that's hard, especially for people who are planting or attempting to multiply, right? Let's try to use I really do appreciate the nuance there, by the way. But the people who are trying to multiply and see fruit in really hard communities, right? Especially if they came from places where you bumped into somebody and they became a Christian, right? And so you felt like, wow, this happens all the time. And then you move into just a really difficult area and it's hard scrabble. I mean, you are really working to have anybody have a spiritual conversation, let alone one to actually kind of lean in. And so this is where those expectations have to be rightly aligned, so that somebody doesn't succumb to sorrow or feeling like they're failing.
Yeah, I would say one of the reasons that I think church multiplication has to become the strategy is this idea of missionary versus indigenous churches. And whether we really want to acknowledge it or not, and maybe there's a period back in American history where there was a more common culture across the country. But I've seen it all the time, and we could sort of pick either direction. You could take someone from the South and bring them to California, and they're going to start a church. Well, if they have not brought with them the same kind of cross-cultural mindset that you would expect an international missionary to have, this is really sort of harsh to say, but you might as well just pack the stuff back up in the truck and go home,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because what you did there is not going to work here.
Absolutely.
Right. But the same thing would be true, if you grew up in New York City, and I don't know what Midwest town I should pick up. And I'll take your home.
I would say you can say Indianapolis. You can say Indianapolis.
I'm going to move to Indianapolis, and I'm going to make disciples and start a church. Well, you better have a cross-cultural missionary mindset about the work that you're going to do, or it's just not going to work because the cultures are not the same. When churches multiply, part of that strategy is it's much more of a sort of an incremental expansion of the church. Now, it's exponential in terms of its fruit, but it's incremental in terms of its people group and cultural progress. So you live in a huge city, Aaron. I don't even know what Houston is. It's over 10 million people in the metro area, right?
We are very big.
It's very big. I've driven from one side to the other. It takes like 2 hours. So you start in your neighborhood and you learn how to reach people there. And then you realize either there's a neighborhood just like ours over here, or there's a neighborhood adjacent to ours that's really similar. And so we send people there, right? Because they're going to be a lot more likely to start an indigenous church in the neighborhood next door than they are if you send those people from Houston to, back to your hometown of Indianapolis.
Yeah. And it's just this idea, like, I really appreciate the way we're talking about this because, even in the example before, a New Yorker coming to Indianapolis, what works in New York isn't going to work in Indianapolis. Even further bit, just the NBA mindset. Like, we are not going to trust a Knicks fan. I'm just saying it. Pacer fans will not trust a Knicks fan.
Here we go, Andrew. Get on the Pacer bandwagon.
And so what I would say, though, is that somebody from New York is going to have that cross-cultural mindset. That's like, we're about something entirely different. We want to actually bring Jesus, who is over all and in all and to all cultures. We want to continue to minister to you all as what is needed here. And then making that same analogy in Houston, this could not be a more diverse city if it tried. And just saying something that works on the southeast side where I live and trying to take it downtown, that doesn't work. And I'm not even in the suburbs. I'm in between, the suburbs and downtown. And it just doesn't work. You can't. And so there has to be an understanding of what that might look like to be cross-cultural in that area. And then if you are going to plant a church, always and continually asking the questions, what do they need here? What does it look like to faithfully, I appreciate that, incrementally see fruitfulness grow, as opposed to, we have a brick and mortar space, we have a name slapped on the outside, we have the capital to let us keep going for a year or two, and we have a bunch of people committed to show up every Sunday.
Yeah. All right, I'm fixated on a couple of things here, and one is what you remarked earlier, Craig, about people want to know if we like them and if they could like us, and if we're likable. That takes time to develop those kinds of relationships. And then the idea of multiplication. It just seems to me, and I've seen this. I mean, we work in a global context where we see the rapid multiplication of the church, but it has become very mechanistic. I mean, it's almost a science anymore. And so people talk about DMM, CPM, and you do these certain things, you're going to get to multiplication, and it can become very mechanistic. And we move away from the relational, and it's just striking to me that if in our North American context, people are asking those questions about likability of us, and even having an awareness that there is more of a tendency to distrust Christians today. And so we need to work hard at being likable, and work hard at being Christ-like, so that people could actually see that there is a difference in our lives as we live them out in our communities. That's not mechanistic. That's the organic that you're talking about. And so how does that plug in then into this organic analogy? I mean, it's almost as if we need to insert the bees in here that takes the pollen from our crops, our fruit, and spreads it into other places so that it, multiplies it in an organic way, not in a mechanistic way.
So I would agree with you. And I think one of the key points, again, this is where multiplication, I think, comes in, is who are we identifying as the leaders of the next new church? And this is really not American, really in a Western context. Pastoring, if you will, church leadership was professionalized centuries ago. It's a long history. It's not something we came up with, whatever in the 50s or 70s or whatever. And because of that, there's just been all kinds of things that sort of come into the Western church because of that. But then when we think of starting a church in the next neighborhood, we have a tendency to think of, who's the professional pastor that we could send to that neighborhood. The question we really ought to be asking is, who's already a part of our congregation, who lives in that neighborhood, who has apostolic, evangelistic gifting? Can we find a few people with the other few gifts to put around them? And can we send and empower them to start a church in that community where they already are, where they're already living out, what it looks like to be a follower of Jesus? They've already got, sort of your comment about relationships, Michael. And a lot of this becomes economic, right? One of the things that's happened at Stadia is, and there was some pandemic influence, I think pandemic acceleration, really, that we went from maybe a tenth of the new church leaders we worked with being co-vocational to half overnight. And I think
that's not a bad thing.
No, I don't think it is. I'm not saying that as a bad thing.
No. Yeah, I think that's a very positive thing. And it's something that we want to keep reiterating, right? That co-vocational is a very positive and very strategic way in which to plant churches. But sorry for interrupting you there, Craig.
Well, no, I think it is key because I think we've tried to be just really clear in our language of the difference between bivocational and co-vocational. And it's, it could be just sort of a semantic thing, but I think it does illustrate sort of a difference. Bivocational is bifurcated, right? And typically a bivocational pastor is someone who's doing church in a model where you would really expect them to be fully supported by the church so that they could work full-time in that church. But the church isn't able to do that, so they have to bifurcate their life, split it in half, and give half their life somewhere else to earn money and half their life to the church or whatever proportions. And those two things are always at odds with each other. And they always are creating tension and problems versus co-vocational, where a person has an occupation that allows them to support themselves, their family, whatever are their circumstances. But that occupation cooperates with their vocation, which is to make disciples, and is actually helping, accelerating, contributing to their disciple making or their church starting, whatever it is that they're doing, rather than working against it. And so that's really the key. And a huge part of it is this time factor that you mentioned, Michael, because if I come into a place to start a church and I know I've raised so much money and I've only got so much salary, right? I've got to get people to come fast.
Yeah.
But if I'm already in that community and I already have a job and a place to live and a roof over my head, and I decide to start a church, my own livelihood is really not at risk. I might be risking some social relationships. And so there are other things that are at risk, but probably not am I going to be able to keep the roof over the head or the food on my table. And so you actually make different strategic decisions, different relational decisions, and you have the capacity to start a church that may look very different from the one you would have started if you knew you had to get to a certain amount of money by a certain time.
There are so many different decisions that pastors and churches make based on what that bottom line is, based on what that, if I do this, will we actually fill the coffers, if you will? If I do this, oh no, that seems like a bad idea. Why? Because there isn't going to be the solid bottom line on the other end. There's something also that I think it underlies all of this, and we're touching on it, which is the fact that in some way, this also does require a redefinition of what, quote unquote, what is church, because akin to the analogy that we've already made, New York to Indianapolis, or one part of Houston to another, if we go even bigger, just because it works in America, or it used to work in America, it doesn't automatically mean it's going to work globally. Or just because it works in America historically doesn't mean it will continue to work in America to gather in the same sort of way. The way that you were talking about this, the way of seeing people who are gifted, looking at them and their gift set, not their vocation or their ability to move and start a new church in a community, means the goal isn't let's find that big building space and have that awesome music. And maybe at some point in the future, they might want to do that, but that would be birthed out of who they are, as opposed to what they see as necessary to then get to that next step. We have to redefine what church is so that we can actually engage in church multiplication.
Right. And I'm a person, I don't believe that those things, if you've got a great, worship band and you're preaching, I don't think those things are unbiblical. But I probably would say they're extra biblical, meaning scripture doesn't require it to be done that way. And so they're birthed out of a cultural context and all kinds of things that kind of are reasons why they exist. But that then means that you've got to ask the contextual questions as you move into a new place or want to reach a new group of people. I don't even know how many times I've said this, and maybe somebody's listening who has a foundation and they'll write the check so that we can go do this. I'd love to find 100 Gen Z, 18 to 24-year-old followers of Jesus, and train, equip, empower, and send them out to reach their peers and start churches with the clear understanding that church can look any way you want it to look, as long as it honors Jesus and makes disciples. Yeah. I would be really curious to see what their churches look like.
But Craig, how do we control that?
We don't. That's the point.
Oh no. That's why your bank account is empty. With this idea, because it's perfect. And I think it's that, again, it falls back on that faithfulness aspect.
Right.
Are we faithfully pursuing the whole of what Jesus is calling us to?
But I think it's missional imagination. Michael, in your book, you talk about, missional theology. You talked a lot about context. I don't remember you sort of using that phrase of, kind of missional imagination, but I think it's sort of a mixture of those things. What results if you have great contextual understanding and great missional theology is there's a missional imagination that's birthed out of that people do things that nobody else is doing because they realize that may be a way that we could make disciples. Paul developed sort of this pattern, right? Find the synagogue and whatnot, but, he gets to Ephesus and they go out to, by the river where there's a place of prayer, or he gets to Athens and, he goes to where the philosophers are having these conversations. And so those may not seem like big shifts, but they were a realization that in different places, we're going to have to start in a different manner. And we're going to have to imagine how people in this place might become followers of Jesus. And again, I think probably the challenge is we've sort of assumed that American culture is this thing, and it's not a thing.
It's not a thing.
There really
is
almost no such thing as American culture. Your neighborhood has a culture.
Yeah, something you're touching on. So, Michael, you're just going to have to bear with me. Craig, let's go for it. It actually does remind me of a conversation about the NBA and specifically the NBA draft, because it's coming up. And oftentimes potential draft picks are looked at through the lens of what exists already, right? So we have a starting 5, or we actually have a starting 4, but we really need to get the franchise changing 5th spot This is what works in the NBA, so we need to look for this type of talent. But the truth of the matter is, everybody who is growing up has grown up playing around their peers. They haven't been growing up playing around the exact same type of peers that were already in the NBA. And so what they do is they develop skill sets. They develop things to be successful on the court, so that when they come into the league, this generation of superstars and the ones behind them are going to look nothing like the existing superstars, forever to be compared. Steph Curry came into the league. Everybody said he's too small. He's not going to succeed. And then as he started succeeding, they're like, well, this can't last because this has never really been done before. This type of style hasn't existed. Steph Curry is one of the best basketball players ever to live. He's revolutionized the game. The number of players that have come behind him look nothing like the previous generation of players. I think in the church, see, I promise it wasn't just fun talk. I think that we are really needing to lean into what we don't have in the church. We can't be looking for the replacement mindset. Okay, we have these leaders in place. We need to replace them. So we need to look for that exact type of player or that exact type of person to fill the role, to fill the gift set in a narrow sense, right? Instead, saying, again, going back to that faithfulness, are you committed to chasing after Christ and his kingdom? And then we need that missional imagination. We need to have some mystery and some uncertainty and some joy, and bring it to Christ and say, can you do this? Can you be faithful? Good. Then we're going to trust the work of the Holy Spirit in and through you to create something in the future that looks like nothing that we have had before, because it's contextual and it is for these people and it is for your neighbors and it is for your friends, because that's where God's called you here now, imaginatively. That's not a word, but
yeah. I would, and I want to be a little bit careful here and definitely respectful to, people who have tremendous skills and are exercising them in a way that is, helping people follow Jesus. But when you do church a certain way, and this is kind of your illustration, then leadership becomes defined a certain way, right? So when we think of a pastor, when we think of a church planter or new church leader, it's kind of like you're saying, we've got this list, like this is exactly what they look like and exactly what they do. And my comparison would be, well, that's probably true if they're going to start that kind of church, right? So if you're going to run that offense in the NBA, then yes, you need that player with that skills. But if we back up biblically to apostles and evangelists and ask not the question, do you have these competencies, but the question, do you have this gifting, and how are you going to live that gifting out? Again, I think that's where there's imagination that comes into play. And not every apostle is going to live out their apostolic gifting in the same way. I could probably argue, we have to kind of like, how do we really define apostle? But I could probably argue that part of being an apostle is not doing it the way it was always done. Apostles are people who are willing to sort of break the mold and to try things and to do new things. And so sort of that shift from here's a defined set of competencies to, wait a minute, let's just start with gifting and maybe even start with calling. And then let's see what God does with that. And then the other thing that does is that increases the pool of people who could be sent to start churches from this small set of unicorns to a much larger set of Holy Spirit gifted apostles and evangelists. Prophets starting churches is, we could have a long conversation about just that, but that's a challenge for me. I've worked with some prophets and it's a challenge. And typically pastors, teachers, shepherds are not great starters. They have a place in the kingdom for sure, but it's very difficult for them to start things from nothing.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Well, I so appreciate the things that you've been sharing, Craig. I think another thing that's sticking out to me is the missional imagination. I love that. I'm going to write it down. I might use it at some point. I'm sure others are using that as well. I can think of, I'm sure Alan.
I would say Alan probably has a trademark on it already.
Yeah, I was going to say, I might just be using one of Alan's terms and don't know it. So,
yeah.
So Alan, you can have credit.
But I loved how you connected the missiological theology and the contextual components too, because that's so important. And it reminds me of a conversation that I had recently with a mutual friend of ours, who said something to the effect that we really are expecting people to make the missional move to us rather than us making the missional move to them. Mm-hmm. We want people to conform to us rather than us conform to them. And we've got to get that reversed. We've got to make the missional move and to be adaptive and creative and imaginative in the way in which we do church, because, it's not programmatic, mechanistic as what it sometimes seems to be. And I'm hoping, Craig, that we'll hear from some Gen Zs that want to take up your challenge. I think that's a wonderful challenge to just see what would happen. Entrusting them with the same Holy Spirit that's in us, see what God would do through their imagination to create ways in which they can connect to their generation.
Yeah, there's one thing we scratched, and it has piqued my curiosity, and I kind of want to roll this out to both you, Michael, and Craig. So if we've happened to grab somebody who's listening to this podcast, not having listened to a lot of other podcasts that we've done or read Michael's book, and they've just heard that we've said one of the biggest and most important things that we can do in the church is just make people like us. And they might be arguing in their mind about the fact that whether people like us or not doesn't really change who Jesus is or what he has done. And they feel this tension of, is the world influencing us too much? Are we trying to, as Michael's rightly said, are we trying to conform ourselves into something that is different than Jesus or what Jesus desires? What would you say to that point of view?
Boy, I can jump on this. And Craig, then I'd love to hear what you have to say. But this fits so perfectly with this next book that I'm working on. That's supposed to be done in about 6 weeks, and I'm working hard to get it done. But it's on the ancient practices of the early church and looking at those early documents that were written by the disciples of the apostles, and trying to understand, how did they live this out? What did it look like? And one of the striking things from all of these letters, First Clement, the epistle to Barnabas, the letter to Diogenes, the letters that Ignatius wrote, is that they were deeply concerned that people conducted their lives according to the image of Christ. They wanted Christians to live like Jesus lived, and for others to see that in them. And that's what made the difference in the early church. That's what, I mean, we're talking about multiplication here. That was, I would say, the key factor of seeing the rapid multiplication of the church in the first 3 centuries, was that those believers lived like Christ in every way. They talked about Christ. They cared for people, and yet at the same time, they weren't all that different culturally. I mean, they spoke the same language, they wore the same kinds of clothing, they lived in the same kind of facilities, and yet the way in which they conducted their lives with everybody that they came in contact with was Christ-like, and that made a difference in the early church. And it just seems to me that we've got to get to that place today. And we're so far behind, I think, in that, just because of, issues that have gone on in our culture in the past decade. And I mean, we can enumerate any number of these kinds of issues that have tainted the image of the body of Christ.
Yeah, I think that's great, Michael. I really, there's a lot of great wisdom there. And actually, I'm really interested to read that now and learn more. That's a period of church history I don't know a lot about. So you got me curious about that. But I think, kind of to what you were saying, Aaron, is one of my first responses is always, Jesus was accused of being a drunkard, a glutton, a friend of sinners. And we forget that he sort of accepted that label. Right. He never did anything to correct that label and say, no, that's not who I am. He kind of owned it, said, yeah, that's why I came is for these people. I think also, though, and even back to sort of where I started, being likable doesn't mean I have to do sinful things. It means I have to do interesting things. It means I have to do things that make people curious about my life. Someone will find some way to say that my coffee roasting is sinful, probably. I don't know. But that doesn't really stand out as this direct violation of some Jesus command of how I'm supposed to live. But man, it's a lot easier for me to start a conversation with somebody I don't know around my roasting coffee than it is around, let me just start at the beginning with, you're a sinner that needs Jesus, right? And so it's not, you don't have to adopt some worldly practices. It just have to be things in your life that would make people interested and curious about who you are. And then those open the doors to then talk about the ways that you're different and to talk about how Jesus is different.
Yeah. No, I love that.
No sin required.
Love Jesus,
love that,
no
Craig.
sin required. Well, Craig, thank you so much for being our guest today. I think Michael and I are going to at least have 12 conversations based on the topics that we have brought up today. I think we have been enriched. So thank you very much for your time. How can people find you if they want to keep in touch with what God is doing through you and Stadia?
Stadia is easy to find, stadiachurchplanting.org. So that's pretty easy. You can't Google Stadia because Google owns Stadia and you'll end up at a game site. But if you Google Stadia Church Planting, you'll easily find us. I'm easy to find. You can find me on LinkedIn, search for Craig Whitney. My email is craig.whitney@stadiachurchplanting.org. So just remember my name, you can get there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Craig.
Thank you for having me. It's been great being here.
This is fun. This is very fun.
Well, we need to have you back. We'll get you back in a year and check in with you and see how things are going.
That'd be great.
It'd be wonderful. Well, for you all, our guests, thank you guests of the podcast, our listeners, people who are joining us in this conversation. Thank you. And we do invite you to continue this conversation with us. Go to our website, Ephesiology.com, check out our master classes, and continue to see what God has for you in the next stage of your life, in your faithfulness and your pursuit of what God has for you in this world, in his kingdom, for his glory. So for Matt, from Michael, Craig, and myself, this has been the Ephesiology Podcast. Have a great day.